To nevertheless try to bring back everyone's thoughts to the time when the murder took place in 1986, we need to highlight a lot of events that placed the murder in its real context. Olof Palme was a person who was right in the center of events during the strained and conflict-filled Cold War 80s. A Cold War where it was about being on one of the great powers' sides. Being neutral could very well be even worse for one of the superpowers because you didn't know if you were an enemy or not. In this double game, the very intelligent and eloquent Olof Palme seemed to thrive. For many years during the 80s, there was also a bloody war between Iran and Iraq, which many countries earned big money from supplying weapons to. Olof Palme had previously mediated in the conflict and was well versed in what was going on and had contacts with representatives from both countries. A dirty exploitation of this conflict, which in recent years has shown that the USA exported weapons to both sides of the conflict, which also describes how extremely cynical the entire warmongering weapons lobby in the USA has been for several decades. It is also important to understand that the USA's administration during the early 80s was governed by people who resorted to all dirty means to win elections, which has been revealed in the so-called October Surprise, which meant that George Bush Sr. secretly negotiated with Iran not to release the hostages before the 1980 election, as it would likely lead to Jimmy Carter being re-elected as president, due to public sympathies. Instead, they negotiated large sums of money and weapons to delay this hostage release so Reagan and Bush would win the election. We will return to the book that describes more about this event later. From a Swedish perspective, Olof Palme was right in the middle of this conflict in the Middle East and aware of the various turns. In this, Palme also represented Swedish interests with a long history of arms manufacturing and therefore wanted to help with arms sales and try to save Swedish jobs. Especially since Sweden did not want to pay for its own rearmament itself, but saw an opportunity to finance it by exporting to other countries. The problem was just that officially, there were high moral rules about not selling weapons to warring nations and conflicts, which made these sales dirty but at the same time very economically profitable, especially for desperate countries in bloody wars. The relationship with the West and the USA had long been a hidden alliance, and many within NATO already saw Sweden as the 17th member. The USA had already since the 50s with William Colby at the helm built up the top-secret Swedish stay-behind network. A group of violence-potential right-oriented people who, in the event that the Soviet Union would occupy Swedish territory, would act like guerrilla warfare in small secret cells. An idea that the West came up with in connection with the end of World War II, when there were no people who could act behind the enemy's lines. Several examples of how the USA supported Sweden economically a lot were that Volvo had been sold in the USA for many years, and much of Swedish export went there. Even when it came to arms manufacturing, the development was joint, and advanced weapons with completely decisive components came from the USA. For example, the Euro and the battery used in Robot 70 came from there, and the engines for Swedish fighter jets were American. So integrated and completely decisive for a strong and economically prosperous Sweden were thus the Swedish contacts with the USA. Despite Sweden outwardly pretending to be neutral. To further understand how hypocritical and deceptive, both to the Swedish population and the world, Swedish arms export was during the 80s, and how revealing it is when these dirty stories are unraveled, it is so clear when private involved, and the Bofors company become the only ones affected and hung out, while the responsible politicians and authority persons go completely free. At the same time as it corrupts the state administration itself in the cover-up, it becomes a power demonstration in authority abuse, and unfortunately in extension exposes the country to both security risks and external blackmail attempts by aware regimes. Information from a documentary from 2013 describes the context very clearly. Bofors affairs during the 80s is a collective name for several different dirty arms deals. It was the company Bofors that was involved in events that even Prime Minister Olof Palme acted as a salesman for. But several of the destinations were questionable, and the approach with intermediaries and bribes was highly dubious. Already in May 1984, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society filed a police report against Bofors for arms smuggling. Bofors had in 1979 and 1980 smuggled 300 copies of the anti-aircraft missile Robot 70 via Singapore to Dubai and Bahrain in the Middle East. According to the arms export law, you may not export war material to countries that are at war, have a risk of going to war, or to a country that violates human rights. To circumvent this, Robot 70 was sold to a company in Singapore, called Unicorn International, which then resold Robot 70 to Dubai and Bahrain. On May 28, 1985, Ingvar Bratt came forward as the man who revealed the affair. But as many Swedes already know, it was only people at Bofors who were affected, as politicians and authorities distanced themselves and blamed everything on the company. On December 22, 1989, Bofors directors Martin Ardbo, Leonard Paulson, and Hans Eklund were sentenced to conditional sentence for goods smuggling by Stockholm District Court. The three had to pay the costs for their defense lawyers, Ardbo 920,000 Swedish kronor, the others over $500,000 each. Nobel Industries was sentenced to pay 11 million Swedish kronor in fines for exporting weapons illegally. During the 1980s, India wanted to buy heavy artillery. Olof Palme had personally brought up the matter in talks with then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. From the Swedish state's side, credit support and guarantee support had also been provided, i.e., that the order would be fulfilled even if India ended up in an armed conflict. The Indian government had at an early stage, already in 1980, made it clear that it did not want to see any intermediaries in arms deals. Both in 1983 and 1985, India returned and expressed its dissatisfaction that Bofors used intermediaries. In the last negotiation round, there were two suppliers, Bofors and a French manufacturer. The order was worth 8.4 billion Swedish kronor. On March 14, 1986, the Indian government decided that the order for 410 Haubits 77B would go to Bofors. Due to Olof Palme's funeral, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was in Stockholm on March 15 and delivered the official message. On March 16, 1987, Sweden's radio's Echo editorial staff revealed that Bofors had bribed its way to the order. Through bank accounts in Switzerland, Bofors had been able to bribe appropriate decision-makers in India. Bofors denied that the payments to a company in Switzerland had any connection to the India deal. On April 29, Minister of Foreign Trade Anita Graydon gave the National Audit Office, RRV, the task to investigate what payments Bofors had made abroad. The National Audit Office's report showed that Bofors had paid out at least 260 million Swedish kronor to a company in Switzerland. The main stakeholder in this company was an Indian, W.N. Chadha, who had been an agent for Bofors for many years. To RRV, Bofors stated that it had liquidated its intermediaries in India in 1985. On August 19, 1987, Chief Prosecutor Lars Ringberg decided to initiate a preliminary investigation for bribery. This investigation was closed in January 1988. In India, the bribery scandal received a lot of attention and is considered to have contributed to Rajiv Gandhi and the Congress Party losing the parliamentary election in November 1989. Bofors director Martin Ardbo was called to the trial in India in 1999 but refused to appear. Olof Palme was, however, fearless in world politics for several years, didn't care much about what would be written on his tombstone, as he himself highlighted in an English interview, and played a very dangerous double game in world politics when he tried to have good relations with many of the world's leaders, and especially the populations that were oppressed in different countries, in the vile events that were going on around the world. He was one of the only ones who dared to criticize the superpowers' actions to win the people's sympathies and also took a stand for the communist ANC in South Africa and against the apartheid-ruled regime. A regime that Palme had long opposed by shipping large sums to the resistance movements and urging the whole world to boycott economically. But it was at the same time as the Swedish Security Service had close cooperation with Western security services. Something that, according to information, was thawed and deepened in 1982, at the same time as Olof Palme won the election in Sweden again. A time followed by major mass media conflicts about submarine hunts between Olof Palme and the Swedish defense. In recent years, however, information has emerged that it was probably the Western powers that drove much of the underwater activities in Swedish waters, and also a propaganda war so that Sweden would not approach the Soviet Union, and the current leader who was open to discussions about free trade agreements and weapon-free zones around the Baltic Sea. A Soviet leader that Olof Palme had plans to visit in April, just over a month after the murder. It is thus in this politically very dramatic, war-torn, and dirty money lucrative context that Palme was shot on the open street a cold February evening in 1986. In this now completely unsolved and obviously covered-up Swedish Prime Minister murder with a strange fake investigation that has been marked by so many strange revealing events, it is not possible to move forward without trying to get answers. Then one must ask the question, how could this happen, and how do we find out what really took place? With the mass awakening that is currently underway in the world, where we now understand how propaganda institutions have influenced us to set aside all our critical senses and label all those with deviant opinions as conspiratorial or sick, there is now a fantastic movement in the mass awakening that is underway. With all the knowledge we now have and that is available in the world, now when gatekeeping media no longer has full control over what we should think and feel. How people are starting to wake up and understand that the exaggerated unhealthy trust that populations, and Swedes in particular, have had for the political establishment in different countries is starting to crack and be revealed. What has even led to an ongoing population replacement and mass immigration in Western countries. This also becomes pieces of the puzzle, in that context and the whole. When people understand that we are really on the verge of being completely censored, deplatformed, and character assassinated, for speaking concretely and factually about important events. When people finally start to understand and see patterns in major events that yet another lone man would have carried out, despite the circumstances never adding up, many more understand that it reasonably cannot be true. It is now that this movement is growing in the world, and the question is only who wants to stand on the right side of the paradigm shift. Who has the drive to challenge the dumbing propaganda narrative? As a summary, there are thus very many current events during the Cold War era that could have led to the execution on Svevigin. There could also have been different motives for why Palme was seen as a risk that could not be controlled, in an eventful and dangerous time, where it was about knowing which side you were on. But as we will see in this film, it is what really happened at the murder scene, and the details and the concrete threats that have been formulated directly to the main character, and those who have tried to dig into the circumstances, that give the decisive puzzle pieces to arrive at this whole.